Hello, welcome to part 3 of my Arkham Horror video review series. In part 1 I showed you how to play the game. In part 2 I showed you how the game looks when you actually play it. And part 3 is going to be my actual full review of the game. Now Arkham Horror retails for $59.95. That's the full retail price, but fortunately Arkham Horror is one of those games that's been out there for literally for years. You can easily find this game online for under $40 going through Amazon.com or even some of the other companies out there. I've seen it all the way down to $35. I think is the cheapest I've ever seen, which is a phenomenal price considering everything you get in the game box. We also can't forget to mention that this game actually comes with a really good box insert. The insert is good enough to hold all the components. You have slots for the cards, all the components, and everything fits in there really nicely, which is something that Fantasy Flight Games isn't really known for much anymore these days. It's one of the biggest complaints people have about the company is that their inserts are pretty much worthless and pretty much fodder for the recycling bin. The components themselves that come for Arkham Horror are extremely, really good, high quality. From the board itself, which I can't emphasize, this is an extremely large board, which is really nice because when you're playing this game, you're going to start getting lots of components all over the board. And this board is going to get crowded very quickly with various things all over the board. So it's very nice that they actually include an oversized board that comes with the game. I know the first couple of times I played this game, I complained about how much real estate this game takes up, but after I started playing it a few times, especially with the higher player counts, I started appreciating how the larger board allowed you to get more stuff on the game board without the game board seeming overly cluttered, which is something that can happen whenever they try to cram too much on one small game board. To use a comparison on the opposite end of the spectrum, one of my favorite board games of all time, and that's out of all board games, is Space Empires 4X. I think it's one of the best space empire building board games out there on the market right now. But one of my biggest complaints about Space Empires 4X is how cramped the board is, especially when you got a couple fleets on one of these little mini hexes. The board gets overly cramped way too quickly, and that's something I can say positive about Arkham Horror with this oversized board. It's not a problem you're going to run into. The cardboard used for the game is really good, high quality cardboard. It's thick. Even the quality cardboard used for the money, the shit, the components, everything, all the cardboard, even for the monsters, is really high quality, including the playing pieces. Now, while it would have been nice to have miniatures, and you can actually go out there and buy miniatures, I think at this point, every single miniature for the Arkham universe has a plastic representation. You go to Fantasy Flight's website and you can buy a plastic miniature for any of these guys if that's what you want. And as a matter of fact, they're actually interchangeable with some of the other ones, such as if you get Mansions of Madness, that does come with plastic miniatures. They're actually interchangeable with the Arkham Horror, which is pretty cool. So if you got in some of those other games, you can actually switch out some of the plastic miniatures. I'm personally happy with the cardboard that comes with the box, but if you're a stickler for the plastic, it's definitely out there for you to buy. The game also comes with a lot of cards. I mean, we're talking hundreds of cards, and these are thick, high-quality cards. They're going to last you a long time. Now, I personally, I'm not a fan of sleeving. I don't sleeve stuff. This game is, I think I bought this game in 2010 or 11. Played it quite a bit. Now, while I'm kind of a overprotective of all my board games, I make sure people don't damage them and toss them and, abuse the heck out of them, so my stuff has a tendency to last a long time. Having said that, I never sleeved everything, and all these cards are still standing up and holding out years later. And while I don't have exact numbers, I would think it's pretty safe to wager I got at least 40 plays of Arkham Horror just out of this game box itself. The game does have a lot of replay value in it. There's multiple investigators. They each have their own investigator sheet. Same thing for the Mythos cards. There's multiple Mythos cards, making you have a lot of replay value, which is one complaint I've heard about Eldritch Horror, which is basically the spiritual successor to Arkham Horror, which comes with a lot less ancient ones. This game actually comes with 8, adding a lot of replay value right out of the box without having to buy expansions. Now, if I had one complaint about the components, and this isn't something that's affected me personally, but I know people who do have issues with telling the difference between certain colors, this game does use a lot of color coordination. Now, while it comes with the city streets of Arkham itself, it's not that bad because while everything is color coordinated, you have the blue for the French Hill District, you have the dark gray, which is for the East Town section of the board. You have to realize that if you have problems seeing colors, you're not going to be able to pick it up. Luckily, they were smart enough to actually include the matching images from the backs of these cards, so if you look at the back of these cards, all you have to do is just match up the image itself from the location you happen to be in. So if you happen to be in the graveyard, you simply look at the image for the back of the graveyard, which is going to help you tell the cards apart. Now, that's a really nice touch, and I'm glad that they did that when they designed the game. Unfortunately, they didn't do the same thing for the gate cards, where again it requires the ability to differentiate between different colors. When you're in some of these outer world locations, you need to draw these gate cards until you get a gate card of the right color. There's 4 different colors. It's red, yellow, green, and blue, and you have to keep drawing these until you get the red color. Now, if you're unable to differentiate between those colors, you're going to have a heck of a time using these cards because there's no other differentiators on these cards at all, and you do have to match them up with the other world locations. Now, like I said, if I had to have one complaint about the components for the game, that would be my one complaint, is that the gate tokens can be a little bit challenging for people who have trouble differentiating between different colors. It really would have been nice if they would have included some kind of symbol or something like that so you can tell the difference between besides the color. They should have put an R somewhere on the card for the red cards. There's definitely enough room. They should put a yellow or a Y somewhere for the yellow cards, a G somewhere for the green cards, anything to help people with problems differentiating colors. It would have been a very nice touch. Again, out of everything that comes with a box for $60 retail, $40 if you buy it online, that's the only complaint I can levy against the components for the game. There's also a revised version of the rulebook, which actually should be in all current copies of the game, but I don't think any of the current copies have the old version of the rulebook anymore. The rulebook's been updated to the 2.0 version, and quite honestly, the 2.0 version of the rulebook is perfectly fine to learn how to play the game from. It's actually how I learned how to play Arkham Horror. I was never taught how to play the game by anybody else. I basically sat down with the 2.0 rulebook and learned how to play the game. Every time I do a review for a board game, it's always very important for me to take a few minutes to discuss the family friendliness factor of the game and the optimal player count. Now, unfortunately, we all know about those games that are fantastic at certain player counts, but as soon as you switch to other player counts, they basically fall apart. A good example I like to use is Cosmic Encounter. Cosmic Encounter plays from 3 to, I think, 7 or 8 with all the expansions now. And while the game is great with 5, 6, and 7, it kind of falls apart with 3, and with an 8-player game, it can get so darn chaotic that you may not even get a chance to play if you're the 8th player, depending on how good or how bad the luck just happens to be. So while the game says it's good for 3 to 8 players, or it plays from 3 to 8, doesn't necessarily mean it's great for 3 to 8 players. Now, Arkham Horror itself lists as a game for 1 to 8 players, which means it can be played solo, which is pretty darn awesome. And you could actually play the game with 1 investigator. While I wouldn't actually recommend that, if you're going to play the game solo, I definitely recommend you have 2 investigators in the game. I think it's far too easy for 1 investigator to get pretty much overwhelmed just by some bad luck. At least with 2 investigators, you can kind of cut the board in half, and having each investigator working on each half of the board to the best of their abilities. With 1 investigator, it's quite easy to get cut off and get screwed and have no way to recover. With Arkham Horror, it's actually better to discuss the amount of investigators you have playing versus the amount of players you have playing, because this is actually a pretty darn easy game for 1 person to play multiple investigators. And I personally think that Arkham Horror plays best with 4 or 5 investigators when you break down the difficulty and also the amount of time you need to invest in the game to play it. Now, when you have 8 investigators, or if you happen to have 8 players, each one with 1 investigator apiece, this game can go on for a long time. You're looking at possibly a 5 or even a 6-hour game, especially if you're crazy enough to play 8 players and start throwing in some expansions. You can make this game an all-day experience. While at the other end of the spectrum, it's possible to play the game with 1 or 2 investigators, but like I already said, it becomes very, very luck dependent with the less amount of investigators you have. As I said, it's very easy. If you just play the game with 1 investigator, you get pretty much cheated because you're going to have bad luck from the draw of the cards, and there's nothing to be able to do about it. I think looking at time frame investment wise, blocking out the potential for random bad luck and just everything that can possibly go wrong, in my experience, Arkham Horror is played best with anywhere from 4 or 5 investigators. 3 investigators is still enjoyable. I've had 6 investigators still be enjoyable, but once you get to 7 or 8 investigators, the game can just drag on far too long for my enjoyment level. And if you have just 1 investigator, again, like I said, it can just be too luck dependent. Now, Arkham Horror does list as a game for ages 12 and up, and while difficulty wise, I don't think the gameplay is that difficult. If your child is able to play any adventure game, using another very popular adventure game that came out around the same time with Arkham Horror, you look at Roombound, the gameplay mechanics aren't much more difficult. It's basically everybody's going to do their actions on the phase, move to the next phase, draw cards, resolve those cards, move to the next phase, try to figure out what you want to do. So the game itself is not really that hard to play. The biggest deciding factor is how you feel about the horror theme and the suggested wording, and images that come along with the game itself. Some of the artwork in the game can be considered more on the dark side, especially when you start looking at some of the artwork for the ghouls and possibly for Cthulhu or some of the great old ones themselves. While not all the artwork is dark, I think Yig is actually pretty sedate. My 6-year-old has looked, I'm sorry, my 5-year-old, he's almost 6 in 1 week, has actually looked at Yig. And it's not something I'm afraid of him to be scared of, but there are some pieces I won't let him look at because I think he's far too young for it. I think Arkham Horror is great as a family game just for the simple fact that it's cooperative. I think cooperative games are always great for families because the family has to work together. It's great because it does play with up to 8 players. And again, I want to go up to 8 players, but your average family is 4 or 5. And that is the sweet spot, in my opinion, for playing Arkham Horror is a 4 or 5 player game. And as I said, while the difficulty of the game is not that high up there, you have a lot of images and stuff along those lines that may be things you wouldn't want younger eyes to see. So having said that, in my opinion, I think Arkham Horror, while it could be a great family game, I definitely would not let kids under the age of 9 or 10 play the game. Just due to the imagery, but do understand that an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old, or even a really smart 6-year-old could easily figure out how to play the game as long as they know how to read. The only barrier to playing the game is your ability to read. If you can read and follow instructions, you can play Arkham Horror. Now, that isn't to say that the decisions you make in Arkham Horror are brainless. Far from it. Your decisions are extremely important because they're part of your strategy. You need to be balancing what is going on constantly while you're playing the game. Just know that it can make a great family game, especially with everybody working together, everybody discussing their decisions together, and everybody trying to come up with a strategy to help everybody defeat that great ancient old one. Arkham Horror, the board game, is an adventure game in the traditional sense of the adventure board game. And it comes with all the positives and the negatives of all adventure games that have come before it. It's not breaking any molds in that aspect. It's basically taking everything we've done with adventure games in the past and molding it with the Cthulhu mythos. So the question you have to ask yourself, if I like adventure games and if I like the Cthulhu mythos, is Arkham Horror a game I'm going to like? And if you can answer yes to both those questions, I can answer yes to your question. This is a game that you are going to like. The game does a fantastic job of marrying the Cthulhu mythos with an adventure-style game, and it keeps the feeling of oppression and keeps everything feeling like what I think the Cthulhu mythos as a board game should feel like. There's a constant feeling of oppression. There's a constant feeling of that you can lose at any point in the game. There's a constant feeling that things can go south for you at any moment. You just don't know, and to me, that's what the Cthulhu mythos should feel like. It should feel like basically you're on the verge of a train wreck, barely hanging on, but there's still a sliver of hope, and that's the feeling you get when you play Arkham Horror. The game itself has a phenomenal amount of replay value. You're looking at 16 investigators that come in the base box, let alone all the expansions that are out for this game. Off the top of my head, I think there's at least 7 expansions for this game, and I bet I'm wrong. I bet there's actually more than that, and if I sat down and thought about it, I think I'd actually come with 8 off the top of my head right now. And these aren't all small expansions. These are giant big box expansions that rival the size of this box right here. There are 3 expansions that are the size of this box, plus expansions that are smaller than this that add more investigators, more ancient ones, more cards, more of everything, more mechanics. It adds so much more to the game. You can expand this game so much if you really want to. Adding rules, make the game more difficult, make the game easier, make the game longer, add more variety, add more challenge. There's just so much out for this game, and it's just the benefit of a game that has been out for, we're looking at 8 years now, almost 9 years now. This game has been out for a long time with lots of expansions, and all of them really add to the replay value. But I want to discuss just what comes in the box itself. Like I said, there are 16 investigators that come in the base box. Every one of these investigators plays differently. They feel different, and they don't feel like they're cookie cutters of each other. And I didn't really talk about this earlier, but there's some fantastic lore on the back of every one of these cards that tells the story of these investigators that helps you get into the theme of the game. The game also comes with multiple great old ones, and every one of these great old ones play differently. Some make for a fast game, some of them make for a long game, some of them make for a very hard game, and then you have some of them that basically say, if you don't manage to stop them before all the gates open, you lose. There's a massive amount of monsters that come with the game. There's, I believe, 60 monsters that come in the base set. All of these monsters play differently, different abilities, different challenges. They're going to challenge your investigators in different ways. And with so many monsters inside the box, with so many varieties, and the fact that these great old ones are even going to change their abilities, I can guarantee that you're never going to have 2 games of Arkham Horror just using the base set that are ever going to play exactly alike. So now you may be asking yourself, if the game plays differently every time you play, why are there expansions for the game? Well, the obvious answer is we all like variety. We're board gamers. We enjoy variety, and we don't like even a semblance of something feeling samey to us. As soon as something starts feeling samey, we start looking for the next big thing, which is the cool thing about Arkham Horror, because the next big thing is just one expansion away. All these expansions add different rules, different gameplay. They add more boards to the game. You can get this game to take up an entire 7-foot table plus a little floor space if you really want to, and if that's what you're up for. And you can play this game anywhere from 2 hours all the way up to a monstrous 8 or 9 hour affair if you start throwing all these expansions and get an 8-player game on the table. This game also offers no player elimination. Now, player elimination in games that take 30 minutes, 45 minutes, even an hour is not that terrible of a thing. But when you're looking at a game that can take 3 hours, 4 hours, or even 8 hours, player elimination can be an absolute nightmare. So that's why I'm glad to say that Arkham Horror does not have any player elimination, unless you've managed to make it to the spot where the great old one has managed to wake up. And the nice thing about that is, even though there's player elimination when that finally does happen, when you do reach a spot where the great old one is woken up, you're pretty much about 15 minutes from the game ending, so player elimination at that point is not going to be a problem. The game is definitely playable soloable, which is not a problem. You have no problems playing this game solo. I personally, when I play it solo, I usually use 2 or 3 investigators. If you're really crazy, you can play solo and play all the way up to 8 investigators if that's what you want to do. I personally wouldn't do it, but I can imagine it make one heck of a chaotic evening to enjoy Arkham Horror with. The game also, like I've already said, plays up to 8 players or 8 investigators. So you can have 2 players, each person controlling 4 investigators. You can have 3 players, each one controlling 2 investigators for a 6-investigator game. The game scales very well in that aspect. And I've already mentioned the fact that I really like the fact that this game board is extremely large. It makes it nice so you don't feel like you're dealing with a cluttered space. Now I know and I agree and I can see the point how it makes this game sometimes unwieldy because you need to have a large play area for this game. This game is big enough that a lot of people who don't have the luxury of a larger game table pretty much have to play this game on the floor or pull up a whole bunch of card tables and start fanning them all around your dining room table. Now, it's not that bad, especially if you're just playing with the base game, but if you're getting those expansions, like I said, yeah, you're looking at needing an extremely large play area. It's not a problem for me, but I can definitely see that being a problem for some players. Now, all this positive does come with a lot of negatives. Now, I hate to say the word a lot of negatives, but there's a lot of potential negative to the game of Arkham Horror. Now, personally, it's hard for me to fairly review a game that I've owned literally for years. I own multiple expansions for it, and actually before I had to go back and review this game, I actually had to play the base game multiple times without the expansions just to remember exactly how the game played without those expansions. Because I'm basically at the point where I don't play the base game anymore, and it's not because the base game is terrible, it's just because I like the expansions, especially the Dunwich Horror. I actually don't play the base game without the Dunwich Horror expansion personally, but that's just the way I like to play. I do have to say, though, that getting back to basics was a nice wake-up call. It reminded me that basic Arkham Horror is actually a pretty darn fun adventure game. Just with the base game, I had a lot of fun while I was missing the stuff that Dunwich Horror actually adds. The game is still really enjoyable for what you get in the box. You're spending $60 for a heck of a lot of replay value and a lot of enjoyment in a really well-designed adventure-style game. Having said that, though, there are some definite negatives that I cannot refute about this game. First, the biggest negative about this game is this game does have a learning curve. And it's not because the game is difficult to learn, it's just the fact that there are so many minute exceptions to all the rules for the game. You have the exceptions that every ancient, great older one is going to make the game set up just ever so slightly different. Yig is going to have cultists be a certain power. You're going to have different ones. Haster is going to make them be different powers for different people. If you manage to choose Azathoth, again, like I said, I'm terrible at pronouncing these guys, but hey, it's my problem. I'm sorry. But as I was saying, Azathoth, if you awaken him, you lose. There's no way you can defeat him. That's the end of the game. All the investigators, they have their own special powers, which are going to modify how the rules are going to play out. They all have their abilities that can be used at different times throughout the game. There's special rules about when you bring monsters into play. If they brought into play without a gate, they don't stay on the board after you encounter them, unless you're in the Mythos phase. You got to remember that every time you manage to close a gate, you're going to banish all the monsters that happen to have the same matching symbol on the gate. You need to remember that. You need to look at the entire board, look at all the monsters that may be in play, and look for anyone that happens to have the same matching symbol. And those monsters with the matching symbol are going to be pulled off the board. You need to remember to do that. You got to remember that there are 5 different movement types just for the monsters in the base game. You got to know that yellow monsters never move, blue monsters fly, green monsters have special movement powers. Red monsters move twice as fast, which never made any sense to me. I always thought that green, because green means go, green monsters should move twice as fast, and red monsters, red means stop, red should be the monsters that never move. Never made sense to me, but it's something you need to learn if you want to learn how to play Arkham Horror. You also need to learn the difference between closing a gate, just standard closing a gate, getting the trophy, or spending the clue tokens to seal the gate and put up a elder sign to make sure nothing can ever spawn in that location again. These are just the little idiosyncrasies for the rules that can be extremely confusing when you're first learning how to play Arkham Horror. Another good example is the fact that every time you're going to draw a location card, you're going to shuffle that location deck every time before you draw, which it seems weird because, like I try to emphasize multiple times, this game does not have a discard pile. Every time you use the card, you're going to put it back at the bottom of the deck it came from. And if it's a location deck, you're going to shuffle it every time you use it. If it's a Mythos deck, you're going to keep drawing until you get that one card that tells you to shuffle the entire deck. Same thing for the gate deck. Again, it can be confusing when you're first learning this game. I agree, the game can seem fiddly because of all these rules, but in my opinion, all these rules really fit the Mythos, fit the theme of the game, and really make sense once you understand how to play the game and you got some experience underneath your belt. There are some other minor quibbles that you can definitely levy against Arkham Horror. First of all, the map. There's a lot of locations which all each have their own individual name, and it's not always quite obvious exactly which location you'd be looking for. There's no special symbols on here, so the first couple times you're playing the game, you're going to be looking at the place that tells you to spawn a gate, and you're going to be looking all over the map, looking all over the board, just trying to find that location, so you throw the gate symbol down. It's going to feel like it's slowing you down, and that's something that will get better as you play the game more. And then it's going to seem really difficult again when you start adding the expansions, but it'll get better once you start learning the layout of the boards. I also think they missed an opportunity with the game board by not adding a few extra gameplay reminders to the side of the board. This board is definitely large enough that they could have done it, and it would have helped early players learn the game. For example, they should have had these various tables right here that tell you the max amount of gates that can be on the board at one time before the great old one wakes up, the max amount of monsters that can be in the outskirts before you start raising the terror track. These little sample additional details could have very easily been put on the board so you don't have to constantly pull out the back of this book to figure out where those things are. Because remember, this is already a game taking up a lot of real estate, so you don't want to have this rule book also on the table taking up even more real estate on a game that takes up a lot already. And the final negative I can levy against Arkham Horror is the fact that it is an adventure game and has the same negative that all adventure games have. There is a lot of luck in adventure games because you're basically fighting a deck of random cards. This isn't different from any adventure game I've ever played. They all are the same. You look at the Dungeons & Dragons adventure system games, you're fighting the luck of the draw every single time you draw a card. It could be good or bad. You don't know what you're going to fight. It's random. You can look at Runebound. The exact same thing. Every time you draw a card, you're going to have an encounter. You just don't know what it is because it can be random and you may be hit by something that you weren't prepared for. You can guesstimate your skill sliders all you want in the hopes of trying to be prepared for a card, but you have no idea exactly what this card is going to actually roll for, so it's basically a luck roll just trying to see if you can get the card that's going to match the right skills. Let's say, for example, you happen to have your skill sliders all the way to the right just because that's where circumstances put you. You have a speed, sneak 4-2, fight, will 4-0, and a lore, luck 5-1. Let's go ahead and draw the top gate card and see what we get. We're going to see that we need to make a lore -1 check. That's not that bad for us. We could have done this, but we're going to look and see that we need to make a speed -1 check. Again, that's not too bad for us. The cards were actually in our favor. Let's draw another card and see just how lucky we end up being. This one would have cost us to make a fight -1 check. Again, that's actually not too bad for us. We actually got lucky. But what if it had us make a sneak -1 check? Now we're already at 2 sneak, -1 is 1. So we need to roll a success on 1 die. Now we got lucky here, but it's not always going to work out like that. And that's just the luck of the randomness of adventure games. Now, like I said, this is no different from other adventure games. Some adventure games are pretty darn terrible about this. I'll pick Talisman as a pretty good example. The basic Games Workshop version of Talisman from the mid-80s was absolutely horrible for the amount of way that luck can go and just trample you down and pretty much destroy you. Or you look at more modern games where you can kind of mitigate that luck by various abilities and stuff like that. Luckily, Arkham Horror does a pretty good job of kind of helping you mitigate the luck a little bit, but again, there's still going to be that luck that you cannot fully mitigate. And of course, let's not forget the randomness of dice themselves. There's been many times where I've had 10 dice to roll and not received a single success just because the dice just happened to hate me in that particular part of time. Even with all these negatives though, I have to say this is the best Cthulhu Mythos representation in a board game out of any of these board games I've ever played. I think this game is a lot better than Mansions of Madness, for example, which without the plastic miniatures that came in that box would have ended up in the trade heap a long time ago. I think this game is better than Elder Sign. While Elder Sign is a good game, it's pretty much a luckfest dice rolling game. You're pretty much playing an over-glorified Yahtzee with a pretty cool theme tacked on top. And then you have the more recent edition of Eldritch Horror, which to me felt much more like a Fortune and Glory kind of game than it did an Arkham Cthulhu Mythos style game. I think Arkham Horror, so far out of all the games out on the market, has done the best job representing the Cthulhu Mythos. And that may seem like a pretty bold comment, but it's a comment I definitely stand behind. Now, I played Eldritch Horror one time, and while I did think the game was very enjoyable, it definitely felt much more like an Indiana Jones Fortune and Glory style game than it felt like a true terror horror game based on the Cthulhu Mythos, which is something that Arkham Horror did very well. I've rambled on long enough here. Arkham Horror, great game. If you're looking for an adventure game based on the Cthulhu Mythos, definitely pick it up. It's a great deal for the price. You're getting a lot in the game box. You're getting a lot of replay value. And you're going to get a lot of enjoyment for your $40. And I say $40 because you can easily find it online for that price. This has been another off-the-shelf board game review looking at Arkham Horror, designed by Richard Lanius. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the YouTube comments below. And remember, I also take review requests. Believe it or not, Arkham Horror was a request from one of the viewers I have. They wanted to see Arkham Horror done, so I put together this video series. So remember, your requests are something I definitely take into consideration. Again, leave your comments, questions below. Thanks again for watching.